Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really interesting bit of British politics, something maybe not everyone thinks about much. What happens to special advisors, SPADs, those key political figures, after they leave government? Where do they actually go?
Right. Yeah, it's a fascinating question. And you, our listener, actually sent us a great starting point.
Exactly. A really solid academic article popped up in our inbox, and we
Good.
thought, yes, let's get into this.
Absolutely. The pieces, let me see. Life After Whitehall, The Career Moves of British Special Advisors, pretty recent, 2023, in the British Journal of Politics and International Relation.
By Orchard, Googlis, and Pickering.
That's the one. And it's not just opinion. They looked at actual data, tracked the first job for, I think, over 500 former SPADs between 1997 and 2017.
Wow. Okay. So a decent chunk of data there.
Definitely.
So for you listening, the learner, if you like getting straight to the core of things, understanding the key takeaways quickly, this is for you. We're going to unpack the big findings from this study.
Yeah, cut through the academic jargon a bit.
Right. And see what it tells us about how power and policy might work, maybe even after someone's officially left their government role. We want to give you that clear picture.
So maybe we should start with the basics. Like, who exactly are these SPADs?
Good idea. They're senior political staff, right?
Oh.
Appointed by ministers, working directly for them.
Exactly. The article calls them part of the executive triangle. You've got the minister, the senior civil servants, and then the SPAD.
Okay, that triangle. So the minister provides the political direction.
Yeah, the elected politician's view.
Then the civil service brings the institutional knowledge, the continuity.
Right, the impartial machinery of government.
And the SPAD, they bring the political, maybe partisan perspective, helping the minister navigate Whitehall.
Precisely. They're clearly influential while they're in post, but this study, as you said, looks at what comes next.
Which hasn't always been looked at so closely, has it?
No, not as much as their time in government. And it matters because, well, these people don't just disappear.
Right. They move on, often into roles where that influence might, continue in a different form.
That's the key point. They could become MPs themselves, or lobbyists, or join think tanks, maybe even senior public jobs. Their impact doesn't necessarily end when they hand back their pass.
Which immediately makes you think about the implications, doesn't it? Especially maybe the lobbying angle, using that insider knowledge.
Exactly. The potential for undue influence is certainly a concern that gets raised, and the article acknowledges that ethical questions exist.
So how did the researchers try and figure this out? They looked at the first job, you said.
Yes, specifically the first job for these 521 SPADs. The idea being that's when their connections and, frankly, their market value based on recent experience are probably at their peak.
Right, that makes sense. The knowledge is fresh, the contacts are current.
Exactly. It diminishes over time.
Okay, so the big reveal. Where did they actually go? What was the most common first move?
Right. Well, the number one destination, maybe surprisingly, maybe not, was corporate lobbying. 31%.
31%. Wow.
Yeah.
So nearly a third went straight into working for companies trying to influence government.
Pretty much. And that includes both people in registered lobbying roles, but also what the study calls shadow lobbying.
Shadow lobbying. Sounds a bit cloak and dagger. What does that mean in practice? Is it just unregistered influence?
Sort of. It's less formal, perhaps, using contacts, networks, providing strategic advice based on their government experience, but maybe without being on an official register as a lobbyist themselves. It's harder to track.
Okay. So using those old connections, maybe over lunch rather than in a formal meeting that gets recorded.
That kind of thing, potentially. Leveraging relationships.
Got it. So corporate lobbying is number one. What's next?
Second most common at 22% was policy advocacy.
Policy advocacy. So think tanks, charities, trade unions.
Exactly. Organizations that are pushing specific causes or policies, but maybe not directly for commercial gain in the same way. Although the researchers do kind of group this under a broad umbrella of lobbying, too.
Because they're still trying to influence policy, just from a different angle.
Right. They're advocating, trying to shape decisions. If you add corporate lobbying and policy advocacy together, you're looking at over half the SPADs.
Over 50% heading straight into influence-related roles outside formal politics. That's significant.
It really is.
What about actual politics? Going back into the party machine or trying to get elected?
That was a third group, around 20%. And yeah, that could mean working for the party or an MP or eventually running for office themselves, though maybe not immediately.
Okay. And the civil service. Did many cross that line from political appointee to permanent official?
That was the least popular path, interestingly, only 7%.
Just 7. Why so low, do they think?
The article suggests the UK's fairly clear separation between political roles and the permanent civil service might play a part. It's maybe not seen as a natural next step compared to, say, countries where those lines are more blurred.
Right. Different culture, perhaps?
Possibly.
So, adding those up, corporate lobbying, policy advocacy, politics, public service. That leaves a chunk who went elsewhere.
Yeah, about 18% moved into what the study calls non-policy professions. Think business roles not focused on lobbying, media, academia, that sort of thing.
Okay, but the main takeaway seems to be that the vast majority, what was it, 81%, stayed in jobs directly related to shaping or influencing public policy.
Exactly. They stayed within the policy professions field, which kind of challenges the simple idea that they're all just lured back into formal politics.
Right. It seems the lure of, well, influencing from the outside, especially via lobbying, is maybe even stronger.
That's certainly what the numbers suggest for that immediate first job.
Yeah.
Corporate lobbying and policy advocacy are the big ones.
And this rise in lobbying, especially that shadow lobbying aspect, feels important. The study flagged it as a noticeable trend, right?
Yes, it confirms what others had observed, that this pathway seems to have become increasingly common. And again, if you bundle policy advocacy in as a form of lobbying, you get that 54% figure, half of them.
But then there's the issue of registration. Lots of people doing lobbying type work, but are they actually on the official lists?
Well, that's where it gets a bit murky. The study found that individual registration as consultant lobbyists was surprisingly low, both on the old voluntary register and the mandatory one set up in 2014, ORCL.
So lots of expats working to influence government, but few personally signing up on the lobbyist register. How does that work?
Well, one finding after 2014, when the mandatory register came in, was that while individuals might not be registered, a lot of them, about 70% of those in corporate lobbying, worked for firms that were registered.
Ah, okay. So the lobbying company itself is on the list, but maybe not every single employee who used to be a SPED ad.
Potentially, yes. The rules focus on consultant lobbyists lobbying specific senior people like ministers and permanent secretaries. There are definitions and thresholds. Plus, the study notes that many advocacy groups, those think tanks and charities, often aren't registered either.
So it feels like there's a gap between the amount of influence activity happening and what's formally captured by the registers.
That's definitely the implication. A potential lack of transparency or loopholes in the regulations, perhaps.
Okay, so let's switch gears slightly. Why are they choosing these paths? We touched on the lure of power, but the study seemed a bit skeptical about that being the whole story, especially for the UK context.
Yeah, compared to maybe other types of policy professionals studied elsewhere, the simple desire to affect politics wasn't seen as the strongest driver for SPADs moving into, say, corporate lobbying.
So if it's not purely about wanting to pull political levers again, what's the alternative explanation, particularly for that big move into the corporate world?
The research points more strongly towards the idea of, well, cashing in.
Cashing in.
Yeah, leveraging those connections, that insider knowledge of how decisions really get made in Whitehall, that's incredibly valuable to companies.
And it's perishable knowledge, right? As you said, contacts move on, policies change.
Exactly. So there's an incentive to use that value relatively quickly after leaving government. It makes economic sense for the individual.
And the environment in the UK facilitates this. A growing lobbying sector. Maybe regulations that aren't watertight.
The study suggests those are factors too. A receptive market for those skills exists. And maybe the UK's specific political civil service structure makes public service less appealing, pushing people towards these other policy influencing roles.
Now, the study didn't just look at the overall picture, did it? It tried to see what factors influenced where an individual spy ad might end up. Party affiliation came up.
Yes, and it was quite a striking finding. Labor SPADs were significantly less likely to go into corporate lobbying.
Really? Less likely than conservative or Lib Dem SPADs?
Much less likely, according to the data. Labor SPADs were more inclined towards policy advocacy, think tanks, unions, charities, or even leaving the policy world altogether.
That is interesting. Any thoughts on why that might be? Ideology? Different networks?
The study suggests potential ideological differences about the appropriateness of moving into corporate roles, or perhaps different types of networks and opportunities available.
Okay. What about their background before they became a SPAD? Did that predict anything?
Yes, strongly. They call it occupational path dependency. Basically, people often tended to go back to sectors they knew.
So if you worked in PR or corporate affairs before being a SPAD, you were more likely to go back into that kind of role, often involving lobbying afterwards. Same for policy advocacy. If you came from a think tank, you might well return to one.
Makes intuitive sense. You go back to, where your contacts are. But wasn't there a twist for those who came from politics or public service before being a SPIAD?
Ah, yes. Interestingly, even those with a background in politics or the civil service before their SPIAD role were also more likely to end up in corporate lobbying or policy advocacy after being a SPIAD compared to people from completely different fields.
So the SPIAD experience itself almost acts as a bridge into those influencing sectors, regardless of where you started.
It seems to have that effect, yes. It equips you with skills and connections that are valuable in those areas.
So the how long they served matter. Tenure as a SPIAD. Yes. Longer tenure seemed to increase the chances of moving into the political sector afterwards. Maybe deeper party ties or ambition develop over time.
And what about working right at the center? Number 10, the cabinet office. Did that make a difference?
It did, but perhaps counterintuitively. Working in those central offices made SPADs less likely to go into politics immediately after.
Huh. Any idea why? Is it like they've seen the peak, or maybe it's just a different kind of job?
The study doesn't offer a firm reason, but speculation might include those roles being seen as a pinnacle. Or perhaps the skill set needed for electoral politics is different. It's an interesting finding, though.
Definitely. And department matters too. Like working at the Treasury versus, say, defense.
Yes, some links there. SPADs from economy market-focused departments were less likely to choose public service later. Maybe their skills just align better with the private sector.
Okay.
And those from security departments were less likely to go into politics, reasons less clear there. Gender, though, didn't seem to be a significant factor in the paths chosen.
Right. So it paints this complex picture, but the flow towards lobbying, registered or otherwise, seems pretty undeniable. And that brings us back to the regulations.
Exactly. The findings really put a spotlight on the regulatory environment. The UK has rules like the business appointment rules with cooling off periods.
To stop people immediately exploiting their contacts.
Right. But the article points out there are questions about how well these are enforced and whether they actually cover all the relevant lobbying activities.
So potential loopholes, like maybe the rules don't apply if you're lobbying slightly more junior officials or if meetings are informal.
That's the kind of thing. Lobbying below permanent secretary level might not trigger registration. Informal chats between old colleagues are hard to police. Transparency can be an issue.
Have there been calls to change this?
Oh, yes. Bodies like the Committee on Standards in Public Life have recommended giving ACOBA the watchdog more teeth, increasing transparency generally.
But it's politically tricky.
It can be. There isn't always agreement on how tight the rules should be. Some argue strict rules might put good people off becoming SPADs or unfairly limit their careers afterwards. Different views on whether moving into corporate lobbying is inherently problematic.
A balancing act, then, between preventing undue influence and allowing people to pursue careers.
Precisely.
So what did the article suggest as a way forward, if tightening rules is complex?
They lean towards boosting transparency. Things like broadening the definition of what counts as lobbying, making it clear who needs to register for meetings about policy, maybe even renaming the register to something like Lobbying and Advocacy Register to cover more ground and maybe reduce stigma.
Make it more comprehensive, more visible.
That seems to be the direction they favor.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. For you, the learner, listening to this deep dive, what are the absolute key things to take away?
Well, first, that the afterlife of these influential SPADs often keeps them very much in the world of policy influence, particularly through lobbying and advocacy.
Right. Their time in government gives them valuable currency, it seems.
Definitely. Second, the sheer scale of this move into lobbying-related roles, coupled with the patchiness of individual registration, really highlights questions about how transparent and well-regulated this whole area is.
The shadow lobbying point seems crucial there.
Absolutely. And maybe a third point is that it's not one size fits all. Party background, previous career, tenure, these things shape the path people take. The labor-conservative difference on corporate lobbying was particularly stark.
Yeah, that was fascinating. It shows different sort of political cultures, maybe?
Could be. It certainly suggests different norms or opportunities.
So the final food for thought. This study gives us data, a clearer picture. But it leaves us with that big question, doesn't it?
The fundamental one.
How do we balance things? How do we let people use their skills and experience after public service while also making sure that access and influence aren't skewed unfairly, that governance stays open and accountable?
Especially when people move from roles inside government to roles designed to influence government from the outside. It's a tough balance to strike.
It really is. There's no easy answer. But hopefully, understanding these dynamics, the findings of studies like this, helps inform that ongoing conversation.
Hopefully.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.